So I want to thank you all for attending this ACRL Oregon webinar. I'm Heidi Senior, reference instruction librarian at the University of Portland and a member of the ACRL Oregon board. Today's webinar, as you can see, is entitled Improving Library Tutorials, the Multimedia Design Principles, I think is hugely relevant for right now. Our presenter is Darlene Aguilar, who's Instruction Design Librarian at Loyola Marymount University. I want to remind everybody your microphone should be muted and your video off also. Darlene will be taking questions at the end of the session, and at that point we'll gather up all the questions that you might have asked through chat, so you can use chat to ask questions, and we'll also allow people to unmute their microphones so you can ask questions that way also. And then when the recording's ready, I'll send out a link to the session along with Darlene's slides and handout. Anyone watching this webinar is recording, so as folks in the future can contact me for the slides and handout also. And you'll receive a link to a session evaluation, of course, and we'd really appreciate it if you'd fill that out so we can continue to improve our offerings. So now let's hear from Darlene. I'm going to mute myself, and I want to thank Darlene for taking the time to share her knowledge with us, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today to learn about Mayer's 12 multimedia design principles. As Heidi mentioned, we will send you the recording along with a handout listing all 12 of the principles. So don't worry too much about taking notes and writing down each principle. Let's just focus on the presentation, and we'll give you further resources at the end. Okay, so let's go over the learning outcomes. So by the end of this lesson, you will be able to differentiate between types of visuals, because the type of image you use does matter. And you will be able to understand the relationship between the multimedia principles and memory. Keep in mind that these principles are research-based, and so we will talk about the way that they affect memory. And you will be able to identify multimedia principles used and violated in media. So these principles are meant to be used in any media that delivers instruction. So that can be a tutorial, a PowerPoint presentation, a handout, or a website like your research guides. So today's lesson will give you research-based strategies you can use immediately to create effective instruction. Now I want to show you an example of a typical tutorial. So this is something you can find on YouTube or Primo. But I designed this tutorial just as an example, but it's supposed to represent what is currently out there and what's currently being produced.
How does memory actually work? As human senses experience the environment, information enters what is called sensory memory or the sensory register. While some information is lost, selected information will be organized in working memory. This information is then integrated or encoded into long-term memory, where it can be retrieved at a later time.
Okay, so take a second and think about how that made you feel while watching the video. Do you think you can learn effectively from videos like this? Put your reactions and your initial thoughts in the chat. Boring. Too much going on. Too much text. Too many words on the page, distracting, too loud. A bit busy. Okay, yeah, these are some typical reactions for a video like this. That's completely correct. Overwhelmed by the sound and visuals, all of the above, yes. So we're going to revisit that video at the end of this lesson to apply what we have learned and identify which multimedia design principles are used and which ones are violated. So before we get into the principles, we do need to talk about the basics of memory so that you can understand why these principles are useful. So this image here shows the general flow of information into memory. When we experience our environment, we take in the information through our senses. which is represented here as the sensory register. Then whatever stimuli we decide to pay attention to, that's what goes into working memory. So working memory is anything that you're paying attention to right now. And that could be me, hopefully, maybe not. Or maybe you could be thinking about what you're going to do after this webinar. So your to-do list could be in your working memory. Or you could be thinking about something that happened to you yesterday. So that past experience is in your working memory. So working memory holds any information that you're thinking about or paying attention to. Now, long-term memory is anything that you have already learned or experienced and that you are able to recall. And when you recall it, that means that you are paying attention to it, so then it goes back into working memory. That's why there are these back and forth arrows here between working memory and long-term memory. When you're trying to learn something, then it's in your working memory, and you could turn it into long-term memory, and that's what we want. We want our students to transfer the lesson they are paying attention to into long-term memory. And learning doesn't really occur unless it is in long-term memory. But we run into some issues when trying to learn, right? It isn't as easy as it's shown in this model because there are limitations in several of these steps. For example, in working memory has a very limited capacity and can hold only a limited amount of information for a limited amount of time, unless we're actively trying to process and remember that information. Now, because working memory has a limited capacity, it is our job as instructors to avoid overloading the working memory of novice learners. So this is the key point of the multimedia design principles. They are principles to follow to avoid overloading working memory and instead allow you to facilitate learning specifically for novice learners. And I'm saying specifically for novice learners for a reason. That actually brings us to our first principle. The first principle is individual differences, and it states that design effects are stronger for low knowledge learners than for high knowledge learners. So all the principles we will go over today are more for novice learners, those with low prior knowledge on the subject matter. For learners who are experts or have a lot of prior knowledge, these principles won't really benefit them. So I wanted to show you this principle visually. So I made this bar graph that isn't from any one specific study. It just shows you the general effects of using and not using the multimedia design principles with novice and expert learners. So on the left, we have the effects of the principles on a novice learner, someone new to the subject. So the red bar with the white dots shows student test scores when the multimedia design principles are used in the lesson, and the blue bar shows the test scores when the principles are not used. And clearly, including the principles in the lesson helps novice learners a lot. And this is more with transfer tests. On the right, we have the effect of the principles on expert learners. And here you can see that if a lesson uses or doesn't use the principles, it doesn't really matter. The learner will have the same test scores. One of the most important characteristics you should know about your learners is their level of prior knowledge, because learners with little prior knowledge will benefit from different instructional strategies than learners with more prior knowledge or experience. And the reason goes back to memory. If someone already has prior knowledge of the subject, then it is less likely that their working memory will be overloaded. Does that make sense? So you just want to use different instructional strategies for different types of learners. And the strategies that we will discuss with the multimedia design principles will benefit novice learners more. Our second principle is coherence. So students learn better when extraneous words, pictures, and sounds are excluded rather than included. And let's look at an example. So you can take a second to read this slide. So this is a typical lesson slide about how scholarly information takes time to create. But there are a lot of extraneous pictures here. The border of hourglasses, the boy standing near the calendar. These decorative images are only slightly related to the topic. And we need to avoid decorative images and instead use relevant graphics like this. So this has the same text as before, but here I have decluttered the slide and included a meaningful graphic that shows the students when different types of information are created after an event occurs. So people tend to use decorative images because they are easy to find, whereas meaningful graphics usually need to be created. But we need to get rid of any images, sounds, or words that are not relevant to the lesson. So try not to include any fun facts that will distract learners. Don't include music or other sounds as the learners are trying to read and hear the narration of the lesson. All of those are unnecessary elements that would overload working memory. When you overload working memory with non-essential information, then students will have to search for the relevant information to remember, and they may or may not choose the right information. This makes it harder for students to transfer the important information into long-term memory, and if they can't do that, then they haven't really learned the material. So the coherence principle wants you to get rid of anything distracting, anything that isn't directly related to the lesson. The third principle is the multimedia principle that states students learn better from words and pictures than from words alone. And I've seen some tutorials like this. You don't have to read all of this. It's just full of words. It's just an example of a really wordy slide. But in general, it's about Boolean operators. So we have all heard the phrase, show, don't just tell. And we can still do that in our tutorials. Adding graphics will not only help novice learners, but it also helps students who learned English as a second language. But of course, the type of graphics that we use will make a difference. When talking about the coherence principle, we mentioned that we shouldn't use decorative graphics. So let's expand on this and take the Boolean operators lesson as an example. So unfortunately, I have seen Boolean operators lessons with this image. I'm not joking either. I really wish I was. So this is a ghost who says boo, and it's not really directly related to Boolean operators. It tells you nothing about how Boolean operators work or what they are. This is just a decorative image that someone included in the lesson for fun, and that happens a lot. People feel like they need to fill in the white spaces with images, and they will use anything they find. These type of images are used because you want to make your tutorial more interesting, but this will only get in the way of students learning. Okay, so what type of images should you use? So things like Venn diagrams are always great to explain Boolean operators. Any images that directly represent the concept or the organization or transformation of the concept, that's what you want to stick to. Graphs, charts, flowcharts, diagrams, those are all great ways to show relationships, but of course they're not the only way. You can still get creative. So here's another way to represent Boolean operators. This example uses clothing color. So those people adhering to the Boolean operators are raising their hands. So the top left just shows you all the participants, and the top right shows people raising their hands if they are wearing red or blue. The bottom shows those wearing red and blue. The bottom right shows people wearing red but not blue. So you can have interesting images that are still directly related to the concept you're teaching. And what you want to do is take all of that text that I showed you earlier in that wordy slide and turn it into narration with graphics like this to improve learning. So to review, the last principle, coherence, wanted us to eliminate any unnecessary information. And now this multimedia principle wants us to add relevant graphics. So eliminate the unnecessary and add the relevant. So up next, we have the spatial contiguity principle that states students learn better when corresponding words and pictures are presented near rather than far from each other on the page or screen. So spatial contiguity means items need to be together in space. If you're trying to teach students about corresponding images and text like this, it'll take students longer to learn and it'll be harder to recall. And I know that these words don't look like they're very far from each other, but remember that working memory has a limited capacity, and you're asking students to remember a letter, a label, and a location while looking back and forth from the image to the legend. But there's a better way. So this is a better setup that doesn't require you to go back and forth and doesn't cause working memory overload. So remember to do this with your lessons. Put the corresponding words and pictures as close as possible. So the spatial contiguity was together in space, but we have a similar principle with time. Temporal contiguity states that students learn better when corresponding words and pictures are presented simultaneously rather than successively. So temporal contiguity wants you to present materials together in time. Unfortunately, there are some lessons that try to separate the narration from the image or video. So here we have the Boolean operators lesson again, but there are two separate buttons. We have one button that says click here to see a description, and the other one says click here to see an animation. So it's either or. You can't do both at the same time. This is asking students to remember all of the narration and combine it with the animation. But because working memory is limited and can hold only a certain amount of information for a certain amount of time, students will likely go back and forth from one to the other as they struggle to combine the information received, which is not an efficient way to learn. So it's best if we have narration and the graphic presented simultaneously in the same slide. So you want your content to be together in space and together in time. The signaling principle states that students learn better when cues, such as underlining or arrows, are added that highlight the main ideas and organization of the words. So for example, bolding a new term lets students know that that term is important. Signaling also draws the learner's attention to certain elements of the screen. So if you were teaching students how to read library records and showed a page like this, you need to be aware that this can be overwhelming for students who are likely seeing this page for the first time. There's too much going on the page. So to draw their attention to certain aspects, you can zoom in to parts of the page, or you can highlight something. You can use a circle to highlight the important information. You can use an arrow to direct their attention to a button. So again, you're just trying to direct the learner's attention to what you're teaching. But remember to include the signaling at the same time as your narration, per the temporal contiguity principle. When you try to follow one principle, you should not try to violate another. So the pacing principle states that students learn better when they control the pacing of segmented narrated animations rather than having a continuous pace. So why is that? Well, when you go out at your own pace, you make sure that you're fully understanding a slide before you move on to the next. But you can also go back to that slide if you need a refresher. So this webinar is at a continuous pace, but remember that you will have the video recording with the controls so you can pause and rewind at your own time. Going at your own pace will allow your working memory to fully process the information. So when you design video tutorials, make sure that the video controls are available for students so that they can pause the recording if they need to, or use the closed captionings if they couldn't hear properly or understand correctly. Oftentimes, tutorials include GIFs or GIFs, however you pronounce that, and those can't be paused, right? And that can be very distracting to learners. If you have more software, better programs like Articulate Storyline or Captivate, they have a lot more pacing options. So not only do they have the next and previous buttons, but there's also this menu on the side that's available so that if students need a refresher later, they can easily skip ahead to a certain slide. If you're using these programs, try to keep the pacing controls available to students. So next we have the modality principle, which states that students learn better from animation and narration than from animation and on-screen text. So students learn better from animation and narration than from animation and on-screen text. So I want you to experience this for yourselves. So I'm going to give you an example that I made up. And while you watch it, try to be aware of your experience of trying to read the on-screen text and follow the related animation at the same time. I'm going to pause to get rid of that order first. See if this works. I'll let you watch that one more time. Okay, just to be clear, that only had text and an animation. There was no narration, so don't worry. So post your reactions to that video. What are your thoughts? Were you able to read the text and follow the animation at the same time? Yeah, a lot of, so in the chat saying not possible to do both. My eyes can only do one at a time. Yeah, that's correct. That's what the modality principle points out, that your eyes can only focus on one at a time. So your senses can't necessarily pick everything up, and your working memory is definitely not going to be able to pay attention to both at the same time. So in this video, your attention was split between the on-screen text and the video animation. Your eyes were probably darting from one to the other because your working memory can't pay attention to all of that information at the same time. So the best thing to do here is to remove the on-screen text and use narration instead. That way you can watch the video and hear the explanation of the video at the same time. So you still have the image, but you know, you're hearing it and it's occurring at the same time, which is also, if you think back, it's following the temporal contiguity principle. If you had just an image that wasn't an animation, if it was just a still image, then having on-screen text wouldn't be a big problem as long as you followed the other multimedia design principles. This kind of distraction can also occur when you have a talking head on the screen. For example, if you could see me right now and the presentation at the same time, there's a presentation, the slide, and me in the corner or something, then your attention would be split between me and the slides. So if you're doing a webinar presentation, it's best to practice to only show yourself maybe at the beginning or at the end, or any time that's just not distracting to the main content. So we also have the redundancy principle, which is very similar to the modality principle. It states that students learn better when animation and narration than from animation, narration, and on-screen text. So students learn better from animation and narration than from animation, narration, and on-screen text. So what's the difference? That sounds very similar to the modality principle. We know from the modality principle that you should have narration and animation, but the redundancy principle makes sure that you exclude the verbatim text. So it's redundant to have the same text as the narration when you have an animated graphic or video. Now there's a clarification. Including some words is okay because it can act as signaling. So if I'm providing a narration to this video about Boolean operators, the words red or blue, red and blue, red not blue, those will only help learners. So short amount of printed text is okay to use with your animation, just don't read the full paragraph verbatim. And earlier I saw some comments about this slide being difficult, right, to understand. And I'm sorry, I should have explained. It would be a video, right? So you would maybe put one picture on the screen at a time and explain what's going on so that you don't overwhelm working memory. So for concepts first, there's our next principle. Students learn better when new terms are learned before introducing complex processes, principles, or procedures. So explain the concepts and define terms before expecting students to do something with it. So for example, before expecting students to use a database, it is useful to give them a tour, define terms that they may not know, like the definition for peer-reviewed or for limiters. You also want to explain concepts before explaining procedures. So you want to let them know how to choose keywords from their research topics before conducting a search. So the violation would be to just jump right on in to use the database without covering the basics. And remember that these principles are all for novice learners. So if a student already knew the basic concepts, then you wouldn't need to apply this principle. The personalization principle states that students learn better when narration is conversational and uses personal pronouns such as you and yours. So don't be too formal in your lessons. The conversational style is used to induce your learners to engage with the computer. Learners tend to work harder to understand the material when they feel like they are in a conversation rather than just simply receiving information from a machine. However, there is such a thing as too conversational to the point of distraction. If, for example, you're using slang terms or if you start cursing, that can be distracting. Personalization also includes putting yourself in the narrative. So an example from LMU is that we include photos of our librarians on our research guides. So this makes librarians more approachable and shows who developed the research guide. Finally, we have the human voice principle that states students learn better when a human voice is used for narration rather than a machine voice or a foreign accented voice. And I know, I'm sorry to anyone viewing this webinar if you have a foreign accent. I think what this principle is trying to get at is anything that's hard to understand. So sometimes, and not all the time, but sometimes people have thick foreign accents that are hard to understand. And if you aren't used to learning from that type of accent, then you're just going to have a more difficult time learning the information. So I do have an example for you with regards to the machine voice, just to give you an experience.
The peer review process works like this. When an author submits an article to a scholarly journal, it is evaluated for both accuracy in content and suitability for publication by a group of experts or peers from the same field as the author. If the outside experts believe it's good research, they give the author suggestions for further improvements to the article and the author revises it and sends it back to be reviewed again.
Okay, so go ahead and put your reactions in the chat. Would you be able to learn from this? Somebody said they definitely tuned out kind of quickly. It wouldn't be enjoyable, not even a little. Oh, someone said they're used to machine voices, but it takes experience. Yes, that's correct. So I think that's what the human voices principle is getting at, is if you're used to something like that, for example, for students who have to use screen readers that reads, that's a machine voice that reads the screen for students who are visually blind. Then they're more used to learning from something like that. So it takes experience and they would be able to learn from a machine voice. But again, for people who aren't used to it and it happens all of a sudden, it can be jarring. And that video specifically was a text-to-speech voiceover, which was extremely hard to understand, especially if you're new to the subject or new to learning with a machine voice. So please try to avoid using this robot type voice. So those were all of the 12 principles, but I want to go back to the original video that was shown so that we can apply what we have learned.
How does memory actually work?
Sorry, I'm going to take away that black border sooner.
How does memory actually work? As human senses experience the environment, information enters what is called sensory memory or the sensory register. While some information is lost, selected information will be organized in working memory. This information is then integrated or encoded into long-term memory where it can be retrieved at a later time.
Okay, so I'm going to have you watch it one more time and then we'll go over all 12 principles.
How does memory actually work? As human senses experience the environment, information enters what is called sensory memory or the sensory register. While some information is lost, selected information will be organized in working memory. This information is then integrated or encoded into long-term memory where it can be retrieved at a later time.
Okay, so let's go over these principles together to see which were violated and which were used. So first, we have the individual differences principle, which said that the design of the tutorial will be more effective for novice learners. This is more of an overall judgment, so let's leave that for the end, but let's assume that the tutorial was made for novice learners, and we'll come back to that one later. For the coherence principle wanted you to get rid of any extraneous words, pictures, sounds, anything like that. So let me know in the chat, was there extraneous content? And if so, what specifically was extraneous? Someone said the images, the fun fact, the sounds, the music, remove the fun fact. Someone said where to start. Yeah, so this principle was definitely violated, right? The music, the chime noise, the decorative pictures, and yes, the fun fact. They were all unnecessary information that would just get in the way of learning the material. So let's go ahead and mark that off. Coherence was violated. So the multimedia principle says that we should use both pictures and words to help students learn. Was this one violated or was that one used correctly? Let me know in the chat. So someone said the pictures were not helpful. There are pictures, but they don't help. right? They don't help to explain the information. And that's great. Yes, that's definitely what the multimedia principle is saying. Yes, it does want you to use both pictures and words, but the pictures should be relevant. So this one was definitely violated. Oh, let me get my drawing again. There you go. So the pictures aren't directly related to the content, so we call that a violation. That one doesn't really count. So for the spatial contiguity principle, that one states that students learn better when corresponding words and pictures are closer together. But first of all, are there corresponding words and pictures in this tutorial? No, right? No, there weren't, especially since the pictures were only decorative. So this principle is not really applicable to this lesson. And that goes the same for the temporal contiguity principle. Again, the temporal contiguity principle only applies for corresponding words and pictures presented at the same time. And since we already determined that there were no corresponding words and pictures, then this principle is not applicable either. So let me say here, I'm trying to write NA, not applicable. So they weren't violated, they just weren't applicable to this specific lesson. So next we have the signaling principle. The signaling principle wants you to add cues to tutorials to highlight any main ideas. So are there any cues used here? So the title, which is in bold, could show organization, but the tutorial could have bolded key terms like sensory register. It does introduce sensory register here, but it's not bolded. Things like working memory and long-term memory, those are key terms that are being introduced. So since those weren't really highlighted at all, I would say it's not really applicable, or not that it's not applicable, but it's not followed. Somebody said the entrance for the fun fact could be a cue, but since the fun fact is not really relevant, it's more of a distraction. If the fun fact was relevant, then maybe it would be a cue. The pacing principle says that students learn better when they control the pacing of the tutorial. So with this one, I know that you all don't have the controls, don't have the pacing, but this is a YouTube video. So let's pretend that students have the direct link. YouTube does have video controls. So this principle, I would say, was used correctly. So we have our first correctly used principle. That's hard to see. Okay, so that one, the pacing's good. For the modality principle, that one says that students learn better from animation and narration than from animation and on-screen text. So answer me this. Was there animation that distracted you from reading the text? Yes, the fun fact, right? Yeah, the added fun fact animation that comes in halfway through can be pretty distracting from the text. So yes, this one was violated. Great job, everyone. Next, we have the redundancy principle, which wants you to get rid of any on-screen text and use only narration if you have an animation. So this was definitely violated because the text is still there and it is redundant with the narration. This text on the screen was exactly the same as the narration. So redundancy was violated. Next, we have the concepts first principle, which wants you to introduce concepts. So again, I mentioned this before, sensory memory is introduced, the definition is given, but working memory and long-term memory, they're just kind of thrown in there without an explanation. So I'm gonna say that this one was violated. The personalization principle wants the narration to be conversational. So what do you think about this one? Let me know in the chat. Was the personalization principle used? Not conversational, somewhat, no, not really. Okay, so I would say that this principle was violated. The text doesn't really have a conversational style. It starts off at the top with, as human senses experience the environment, but it could have said, as your senses experience the environment, right? And I think they were trying to add some personalization with this agent here, this lady, but it doesn't really work well, I think, especially because it's just an image. So I would say that they could have done better with the personalization principle and being more conversational in their text. Finally, we have the human voice principle that says that a human voice should narrate rather than a machine voice. So this one was used correctly, right? It was actually my voice, my human voice, that narrated this one. So that one was followed. Oh, there you go. This one was correct. Okay, so now we can go back to the first one, the individual differences. After seeing all of these violations on a video for novice learners, I think we can safely say that learners will not learn well from this tutorial. So this design would produce negative results for novice learners. So just in the overall, individual differences was violated since there were so many other principles violated. Okay, so now we've come to the questions. If you have questions, you can go ahead and put them on in the chat, and we will answer them before we wrap up.
And I'll just say you can also unmute yourself and ask a question in person if you would like.
Did I create the brain slide? Yeah. How did I create the brain slide? Let me find it for you. Oh, this one, no, I didn't create it, but you could easily create this one. I mean, it depends on what software you're using, but I think you could even do it on PowerPoint. It's just, you know, putting lines and then putting text right next to it. Oh, there's a lot of questions here. How can we accommodate/mitigate the animation and text situation for learners who can't hear and need closed captions? What are the best practices for providing closed captions for that principle? That's a great question. For closed captioning, definitely make it optional to have on the screen. So for some people, closed captioning isn't needed and they can be distracted by it. So they should be allowed to turn it off. And for those that need it, then they can turn it on. And those that usually need closed captioning, it won't really overwhelm their working memory because they're not receiving the audio input from that. So they're usually their modalities aren't all overwhelmed because they don't have one of those, right? They don't have the audio portion of it. So the closed captionings will still work well for them. But again, make it optional for everyone. So in case they feel like they're being distracted, they can just turn that off. How long on average does it take you to produce a 3-minute video following all of these principles? That's a good question, because I think it depends on everyone's own workflow. For me, I'm a contracted instructional designer, and so I'm not a librarian by background, I'm an educator. And so when I produce a video, from each stage, I first start off with a storyboard, and then I send that to the librarians in the library to make sure that they are okay with it. Once that's done, I do make the video, a draft of the video, and again, I send it back to them to get their input and make any changes that they require, and then produce the final video. So it all depends on how long they take to to provide me feedback and how long and how many changes are required. But I would say a 3-minute video would probably, plus it's not my only job, my only work. So usually I would say it takes me a month, but again, it's not the only thing I'm doing. So if it was the only thing, it would probably take me 2 weeks if I got the feedback on time. That includes all of the planning, all of the gathering of information, and then trying to figure out how to put it all together in a video. So it says, do you know of any good basic source of great information literacy tutorials that follow the principles? I don't want to, I guess, toot my own horn here, but this is what I do. I produce information literacy tutorials and I try to follow the principles as much as I can. So you can go to the LMU website. I know we have a YouTube page. There are some information literacy tutorials. Most of them are on how to use the library, but we do have a YouTube page there that you can look at some of the video examples. Oh, I hope I'm not missing some questions. Okay, so for some tutorials I was involved with, our group intentionally asked the narrator to read all text on the screen so it would be translated in the translation file of narration. And so auto translation, like on YouTube, could pick it up. Yeah, sometimes, right, it would be difficult to follow depending on some of these principles depending on the software. You just have to work with the software that you have and do what's best to make sure it's also accessible. Somebody said, how many hours of actual work does that represent? I haven't actually timed it all, so I'm trying to give you a ballpark because, like I said, I do still have to work the reference desk and I do chat and some other things for the library. So when I break it down, maybe 40 to 60 hours of work with actually thinking about the instructional design part of it. And this is with already knowing how to use the software as well. Clarification, like to read the full sample of a paragraph that was being shown on the screen when the goal was to figure out the signal phrase. I'm not sure what that means. So do you have any info or studies on students who prefer videos versus written documents or both for understanding concepts? Preference, I mean, not any studies. Well, I will give you the book where all of these principles came from. So you'll have all of the studies based on these principles. But in regards to preference for videos versus written documents, I don't really have that. I couldn't name a study, but I'm glad you said preference because it really is just a preference, right? I think in terms of instructional design, what works best for videos where you have some kind of process, something that has to be done or has to be transformed. With anything like that, videos definitely work best. If you're showing a process of how to do something, you definitely want to include a video to show students, to provide that demonstration. Sometimes I know people want a quick answer, and you can't always get one when there's a video to watch. Not that I'm against video tutorials. Yeah, that's correct. I think that's why at the same time we also have our FAQs that we refer students to. Sometimes on the video itself, I know that there's markers you can put. So for some of the most commonly asked questions, so in the description, you can, signal that at this video time, you can skip ahead and find out this information. I don't know if you've ever experienced that before. They'll have a time next to the information, the specific information that they're looking for. And so you could click on that time and the video will skip to that portion. So that's how you can quickly get the answer for some students. Yeah, somebody said providing transcripts of the video narration is always helpful to find a quick answer as well, right? That they can easily press Control F and type in what they're looking for, and it'll skip down to exactly what they're looking for. Providing students with as many options is always best. So if you have a video, you should also have captions. And if you can, you should also provide the transcript. Again, these are just options that students will be able to decide which one works best for them. Could you provide the URL to LMU's libguide/videos? I will. Let me see. I think I know if you Google LMU YouTube videos, you'll find that really quick. For the libguides themselves, it should be libguides.lmu.edu. Oh, Heidi, yeah. Heidi mentioned how her software allows you to add markers after uploading the video. Somebody asked about getting a written document of the design principles. Yes, there's a handout that will be mailed to you, emailed to you, that lists all of the 12 principles. So thanks for bringing that up. And actually I have, in case, I know this is being recorded, so in case somebody sees it in the future, there's also a QR that I'm going to provide in a second. So you can get the handout. So let me just show you a few things that I had already mentioned, but here are some book recommendations. We have the e-learning and the science of instruction, which is by Richard E. Mayer and Ruth Clark. And we have the book Applying the Science of Learning, which again is by Richard E. Mayer. And these principles are the Mayer's multimedia principles. He's the one who wrote the books on them, did the studies. So if you have the PowerPoint, there is a link on these images. You can go ahead and click on the link to see more of the book. Yeah, somebody asked if there was a service that does closed captioning or how is that done? Yeah, 3Play Media, thank you, Jen, for suggesting that. They're a really great source for closed captioning and transcripts. Another thing, you should investigate the software that you're using. For example, PowerPoint does have, PowerPoint, I think Google Slides both have the option to auto caption. So as you're presenting, it can be capturing your words. If you do it on YouTube, when you upload the video, it is, they do have auto-generated captions, but I will say always try to go in there and correct them afterwards if you have the chance, because auto-generated captions are done by a machine and they're not always perfect. So sometimes they won't have the right grammar or capitalization, punctuation. Maybe they'll miss a word that you said and they'll write it incorrectly. So definitely go in there and you can correct the already generated captions, which cuts down on some time so you don't have to do it from scratch. But these are great books here. The e-learning and science of instruction will have all of the multimedia design principles along with the studies and the science of learning information behind them. And applying the science of learning, that's more of an introductory book. So if you're interested in the science of learning, instructional design, this is a really great basic book that will give you the first steps on how to start to improve your learning. Are there any other questions? Yeah, PowerPoint and other programs like Google Slides will do closed captioning. When you're doing a live presentation, they'll have the captions on the bottom usually. So that's an option you can have when you're doing a live presentation. It's not the best because it can be distracting for some, right? But if accessibility is a concern, I would say just go ahead and do it. Are there any more questions? Okay. So thank you so much for coming. I know that these are stressful times, but just make sure that you understand that this can also be helpful for your faculty who's transitioning to teaching online right now. So once the video becomes available, make sure to send them this. If you have any questions or would like to contact me, you can find me on LinkedIn, and my Twitter handle is @DarleneA_ID. ID stands for Instructional Designer. If you have a smartphone, what you can do right now is open the camera and just point it to the QR code on the screen, and that should give you access to the Multimedia Design Principles handout that lists all 12 multimedia principles. But I will send it along with the recording of the webinar. So the PowerPoint, the handout, all of that will be sent, but in case, maybe if somebody's seeing this afterwards, just seeing the recording, they can use their phone. Again, just point the camera. You don't need to click anything. Just point the camera to the QR screen, and it should open up the website for the handout. But that's it for me. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here.
Yeah, and I'll just say thanks also, and thanks to Darlene, and we'll send out that evaluation form as well, and we'll hope to see you at an upcoming ACRL Oregon webinar. Good luck, everyone.